In the history of Judas Priest, there are bands that did not merely create music. They shaped an entire genre. From the late 1970s onward, Judas Priest became one of those names, a band that helped define the sound, the image, and the spirit of modern heavy metal. Their albums rang out with sharp twin guitars, powerful metallic melodies, and a stage style that became symbolic of an entire era. Behind that sound stood two guitarists side by side on stage, creating what fans would later call the twin guitar attack. One of those two was K.K. Downing, a co-founder of the band, a guitarist from the industrial Midlands of England, and one of the figures who helped shape the language of heavy metal for more than 4 decades. For many years, Downing was almost inseparable from Judas Priest. From the early days when the band was still playing in small clubs in England, to the time when they became one of the biggest names in metal on international stages, his image was always tied to the history of the band. But Downing's story did not end the way many fans once expected. After more than 40 years with Judas Priest, he left the band. There was no major scandal, no loud collapse, only a decision that left both fans and observers in the metal world asking many questions. The band continued to move forward. Tours still took place. The new albums were still released. But the co-founder of the band, the man who had helped build the signature sound of Judas Priest, was no longer standing on stage with them. And from that point, a rare paradox in the history of rock began to emerge. What happens when a guitarist helps create a heavy metal legend, yet ultimately must watch his own legacy continue from the outside? K.K. Downing was born in 1951 in West Bromwich, an industrial town located in the West Midlands of England. It was not a place filled with glamour. Life here revolved around factories, working-class neighborhoods, and the heavy rhythm of post-war Britain. Downing's childhood was closely tied to that world, an environment of working-class Britain, where many families relied on the steel and manufacturing industries. There were not many paths out, and for many young people in the area, music became one of the few forms of escape. During the 1960s, the Birmingham and Midlands region began producing a new kind of sound. Rougher, heavier, and darker than traditional rock. Bands such as Black Sabbath, Led Zeppelin, and Deep Purple were gradually shaping the foundations of what would later be called heavy metal. Downing grew up right in the middle of that changing musical environment. At a young age, he began playing the guitar, at first simply as a way to explore the music he heard on the radio and on the vinyl records of the era. The guitarists who strongly influenced him at the time included Jimi Hendrix and Eric Clapton, musicians who were expanding the limits of the electric guitar in blues rock and psychedelic rock. From them, Downing learned that the guitar could be both powerful and expressive, both technical and personal. But from the very beginning, Downing had a slightly different way of thinking about the guitar within a rock band. Instead of imagining a lead guitarist and a rhythm guitarist, he began to envision a different model. 2 guitarists standing on equal footing, together building the sound of the band. Not only supporting one another, but also conversing with each other through riffs, harmonies, and interwoven solos. At that time, this idea was not yet common. But a few years later, when Downing joined a local band called Judas Priest, that very mindset would become one of the most important musical characteristics of the band, and later of heavy metal itself. In the late 1960s, as the new wave of rock was spreading across Britain, K.K. Downing joined a local band with a rather unusual name, Judas Priest. The early years of the band were not easy. Most performances took place in small clubs around the Midlands, where audiences often stood right up against the stage, and the sound was sometimes rougher than the speaker systems themselves. The band's lineup changed constantly, and like many rock groups of that era, Judas Priest was still trying to find its own identity. In the early 1970s, the lineup of the band gradually stabilized and began to form the elements that would become the foundation of Judas Priest for many decades to come. At the center of the band were four names: K.K. Downing on guitar, Glenn Tipton, the second guitarist with a distinctly different style, Rob Halford with his soaring and dramatic vocals, and Ian Hill holding down the solid bass behind them. It was within this lineup that one of the most important musical characteristics of Judas Priest began to take shape. In many rock bands of that time, the guitar was usually divided into two clear roles. One player performed rhythm guitar, maintaining the foundation of the song, while the other handled lead guitar, playing solos and the more prominent melodic lines. But Judas Priest began developing a different approach. Instead of separating the two roles, Downing and Tipton built a model in which two guitars existed together at the front line of the sound. Riffs were not only played individually, but were often doubled, harmonized, or developed into the distinctive guitar harmonies that would become a signature of the band. The two guitarists might play the same riff, but in different intervals, creating a thick and sharp layer of sound. In other moments, they would split apart, forming a dialogue between the two guitars, one leading the melody, the other responding with different musical phrases. This combination gave Judas Priest a sound very different from many hard rock bands of the same era. Part of that difference came from the musical personalities of the two guitarists themselves. Downing was often associated with direct and powerful energy. His riffs tended to be simple but highly effective, carrying a sense of speed and weight. On stage, he was also one of the most energetic members of the band, often moving constantly, interacting with the audience, and creating a guitar hero image that became very characteristic of metal. In contrast, Glenn Tipton often brought a greater sense of technique and clearly structured melodic ideas. His solos were usually carefully constructed, rich in melodic phrasing, and highly precise. If Downing brought strength and energy, Tipton brought finesse and balance. It was precisely this difference that created a special musical dynamic within Judas Priest. See, the two guitarists did not try to play the same way. They complemented each other. Over time, Judas Priest's twin guitar approach became one of the defining characteristics of heavy metal. Their powerful harmonized guitar sound influenced not only the generation of the new wave of British heavy metal, but also later thrash and power metal bands. And at the center of that sound, throughout the band's early years, there was always the image of K.K. Downing, a guitarist from West Bromwich who, together with the band, was helping to build the foundation for one of the greatest legacies in heavy metal. By the late 1970s, Judas Priest was no longer just a hard rock band from the Midlands. They were gradually becoming one of the most important forces in the formation of modern heavy metal. One of the earliest milestones was the album Sad Wings of Destiny in 1976, This album is often regarded by many critics and fans as one of the first recordings to truly define the sound of metal. Sharper guitars, more dramatic song structures, Chikum and the soaring vocals of Rob Halford becoming the center of the entire sound. In the following years, Judas Priest continued to develop that style through a series of important albums. With British Steel in 1980, the band began to achieve greater commercial success. Songs with clear, direct, and recognizable riffs helped them expand their audience beyond the underground metal community. By the early 1980s, Judas Priest had become one of the major names in international metal. The album Screaming for Vengeance brought the band to a new level with large tours and a strong presence in the American market. 2 years later, Defenders of the Faith further reinforced their position as one of the most important metal bands of the era. Throughout this entire period, K.K. Downing was not merely a guitarist standing on stage. He was a core part of the creative machinery within the band. Downing took part in writing riffs, building arrangements, and developing what many fans called the signature guitar attack of Judas Priest. His powerful and decisive riffs often served as the backbone for many songs, while the guitar harmonies with Glenn Tipton created a very distinctive metallic layer of sound. Together with Halford and Tipton, Downing became one of the central figures of Judas Priest during the period when heavy metal was shaping its identity. It was not only the music that was changing, the image of metal was changing as well. Judas Priest was one of the bands that helped popularize the leather and studs style. Leather jackets, metal spikes, and a stage image that felt mechanical and powerful. Over time, this style became an icon of heavy metal, adopted by countless other bands. The influence of Judas Priest spread across many later generations. Bands of the new wave of British heavy metal drew inspiration from them, and the musical elements developed by Priest also became a foundation for later genres such as thrash metal and power metal. For many decades, Downing was almost always present at the center of all of it. From major tours to enormous festival stages, the image of him with his flying V guitar became a familiar part of Judas Priest. For more than 40 years, his presence in the band was almost taken for granted, until, in the early 2000s, things began to change. By 2011, after more than 4 decades of activity, Judas Priest announced something that led many fans to believe they were witnessing the final chapter of the band. The band revealed a major tour called the Epitaph Tour, promoted as a farewell tour after many years of performing on stages around the world. For many fans, this felt like a symbolic ending. Judas Priest had lived through multiple eras of heavy metal, from the early days of the 1970s to the point when metal had become a global phenomenon. And if this truly were the final tour, it would be a fitting farewell. But shortly before the tour began, another announcement appeared. K.K. Downing was leaving the band. After more than 40 years with Judas Priest, the co-founder of the band would not take part in the very farewell tour of the group he had helped build. For many fans, this news was shocking. Throughout the history of Judas Priest, Downing had almost always been an inseparable part of the lineup. Together with Glenn Tipton, he formed the guitar duo that shaped the sound of the band. And his stage presence, the flying V guitar, the fierce energy, and the distinctive performance style, had become part of the identity of Judas Priest. But this time, he would not be there. The exact reason for this decision was never completely clear. According to what Downing later shared, part of the decision came from exhaustion after many years of constant touring. More than 4 decades of traveling around the world on tour is a long journey, and at a certain point, he felt that he no longer wanted to continue living that lifestyle. But that was not the only reason. In the years that followed, Downing also mentioned internal disagreements within the band, as well as a feeling that Judas Priest was moving in a direction he no longer fully agreed with. Whatever the specific causes may have been, the final decision remained the same. He left. To replace Downing, Judas Priest recruited a younger guitarist, Richie Faulkner. Faulkner joined the band just before the Epitaph tour began and quickly became part of the new lineup. And Judas Priest continued. Tours still took place. New albums were still released. The band still stood on the major stages of the metal world. But for many longtime fans, something had changed. One of the founders of Judas Priest, the man who had helped build the sound of the band from the very beginning, was no longer standing in the lineup. After leaving Judas Priest in 2011, K.K. Downing entered a completely different phase of his life. For more than 40 years before that, he had almost always lived within the familiar rhythm of a major metal band, recording albums, preparing tours, moving between cities and countries, and then returning again to the studio. It was a cycle that lasted for decades, where the stage and the music were always at the center of everything. But after leaving Judas Priest, Downing almost disappeared from the spotlight. In the first few years, he rarely appeared in public. There were no major tours, no notable music projects. For many fans, that silence only made the story of his departure from the band even more mysterious. Over time, Downing began to speak more about his years in Judas Priest and about the deeper reasons behind his decision to leave. In 2018, he published the memoir Heavy Duty: Days and Nights in Judas Priest. The book did not simply recount the journey of a guitarist in one of the biggest metal bands in the world, but also opened a personal perspective from Downing about what had happened inside the band over many years. In the memoir, he wrote about long-standing disagreements between members, debates over the direction of the band, and the feeling that over time his role within Judas Priest had changed. Downing also described a growing sense that he was no longer truly involved in the important decisions of the band as he once had been. According to him, there were moments when he felt that he was standing on the sidelines of a band that he himself had helped found. These revelations led many fans to reconsider Downing's departure in a different way. It was not simply exhaustion after many years of touring, but also the result of a longer and more complex process within the band. One of the most notable moments in this story took place in 2022. After many decades of influencing the history of metal, Judas Priest was finally honored at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. It was an important milestone for the band, an official recognition of their role in shaping heavy metal. At the ceremony, Downing appeared on stage together with the members of Judas Priest. For many fans, simply seeing him standing once again beside his former bandmates carried a special meaning. During the performance at the ceremony, Downing picked up his guitar and played with the band. The first time in many years that he had returned to the stage with Judas Priest. That moment led many fans to hope that it might be the beginning of a greater reconciliation. But that did not happen. After the ceremony, Downing did not return to the official lineup of Judas Priest. The band continued to operate with its current lineup, in which Richie Faulkner holds the guitarist position alongside Glenn Tipton in the band's activities. As a result, the moment at the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame became something rather unique in the history of Judas Priest. A co-founder of the band returned to the stage during a ceremony honoring their legacy. But afterward, everyone continued along their own separate paths. Downing returned for a symbolic moment, but in reality, he still stands outside the band that he helped create. For many years after leaving Judas Priest, many fans believed that K.K. Downing might have truly closed the greatest musical chapter of his life. He had spent more than 4 decades building Judas Priest, and when he left the band in 2011, it seemed as though it could be the final point of his long journey on stage. But over time, Downing began to think differently. Music, especially heavy metal, had never truly left his life. The riffs, the guitar ideas, and the feeling of standing on stage were still there. And after many years of near silence, he decided to return. In 2020, Downing announced a new project, KK's Priest. The name of the band immediately attracted attention. For many metal fans, it clearly evoked Downing's past with Judas Priest, while also affirming that he still wanted to continue the musical path he had helped build since the 1970s. The lineup of the band also carried a familiar element. One in the position of vocalist was Tim Owens, who had sung for Judas Priest in the late 1990s and early 2000s, when Rob Halford temporarily left the band. Owens, often known by the nickname Ripper, had spent many years within the world of traditional metal and brought a powerful vocal style that suited the sound Downing wanted to pursue. Joining them was a group of veteran metal musicians, forming a new lineup that still carried the familiar spirit of classic heavy metal. In 2021, the band released their first album, Sermons of the Sinner. The sound of this album contained many elements that longtime Judas Priest fans could immediately recognize. Powerful guitar riffs, fast rhythms, and song structures rooted in the spirit of traditional heavy metal from the 1980s. For Downing, this project was not an attempt to replace Judas Priest. Instead, it was more like a new chapter, a way to continue telling his own musical story. Not from inside the band he had co-founded, but from outside it. In the long story of Judas Priest, K.K. Downing was not simply a guitarist standing on stage. He was one of the people who laid the foundation of the band from the very beginning, a co-founder and part of the guitar duo that helped define the sound of Judas Priest for many decades. Together with Glenn Tipton, Downing built one of the most famous twin guitar partnerships in the history of metal. The two guitars did not simply divide the roles of rhythm and lead. They harmonized, conversed, and then created dense layers of metallic sound, a style that would later become a signature of the entire genre. On many of Judas Priest's important albums, Downing's sharp and direct riffs became a core part of the band's sound. Those guitar attacks did not only shape the songs of Priest, but also helped shape the way many later metal bands wrote riffs and constructed their song structures. Downing's influence spread across many later generations of heavy metal. During the new wave of British heavy metal movement, many young bands learned from the twin guitar formula of Judas Priest. Later, when thrash metal emerged in the 1980s, Guitarists from new bands continued to develop the riff and harmony approach that Priest had laid the groundwork for. And in European power metal, the harmonized guitar sound almost became an essential characteristic. Over time, the thousands of guitarists around the world learned to play from the albums of Judas Priest, from simple but powerful riffs to complex guitar harmonies, and even the stage performance style that Downing and Tipton developed over many years. But Downing's story also raises an interesting question about how we understand the legacy of a band. When a band exists for many decades, its lineup can change. New guitarists may appear, new albums may be released, and the story of the band continues moving forward. But that leads to a larger question. Who truly owns the legacy of a band? The founders, the people who created the original sound, or the band itself, an entity that continues to exist even as its members change over time? The story of K.K. Downing is not the story of a guitarist disappearing from the history of heavy metal. For more than 4 decades, he stood at the center of a band that helped shape an entire genre. Together with Glenn Tipton, Rob Halford, and Ian Hill, he helped turn Judas Priest into one of the most iconic names in metal. The guitar riffs, the sharp harmonies, and the twin guitar style that he helped build continue to resonate through countless bands that came afterward. But Downing's story also carries a rare paradox in the history of rock. A guitarist helps create a legend, yet ultimately stands outside it. Judas Priest continues on its path, and Downing does as well, with new chapters in his own music. Perhaps that is what makes this story special, because sometimes in the history of rock, legacy is not written only by those who remain on the stage. It is also written by those who decide to step down and continue their path in another direction. If you are interested in the real stories behind rock legends, the journeys, the decisions, and the moments that shaped an entire era, subscribe to the Icons and Legacies channel to explore many more stories from the history of rock and heavy metal.